living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. We're real pleased to have Ken Plum with us from Northern Virginia. Welcome, sir.
Woody, it's good to be back.
Any of your constituents being impacted by this government shutdown?
Woody, unfortunately, it's the case. Northern Virginia has a lot of federal employees. A lot of those employees are in the category of where they're in the layoff stage, and it's a failure of government on the part of the executive as well as the legislature at the federal level to not get a handle on the issues that separate them. There's nothing before us that says that what you ought to do is take 800,000 people and put them out of work. It's something that the president needs to show leadership on rather than leading the way that he is. And it's something that Congress has to do by standing up and saying, number one, we're going to pay these people for the time they've lost, and number two, we're going to deal with these issues in a more responsible manner.
And of course, the unfortunate thing, those federal employees may ultimately get paid, but they're federal contractors, people who may be janitors, for example, in some of the federal office buildings who won't get paid.
Long-term people who've dedicated their lives to public service, and this is the rewards we give them. I don't think that's the American way to do business. So I am of an opinion that we need to make sure that our senators and our Virginia senators have certainly stood up to do this, respond to this, but the Senate generally stand up and take on the president, if you will, and say it's not the way to do business.
And of course, one of the actions that Congress took last year is having a significant impact in this session that relates to the tax cut and the necessity for Virginia to address whether it's going to conform to the federal tax code.
Yeah, and Woody, the answer is we're going to conform in a way that will make it convenient for Virginia taxpayers to prepare their federal form and to prepare their state form. We've always tried to do that so that Virginia taxpayers won't have to start anew when they do the Virginia form. So conformity is one of the issues involved with it. But aside from that, the issue is in terms of the tax monies that come available, what should be our position in terms of what we do? I thought, frankly, that the federal tax cut was a big mistake in terms of how it dealt with our local citizens. You know, if you're very rich and got a lot of money, you got a tax cut. If you're on the lower end of the scale, you didn't receive that benefit. And what we got to make sure of is that when we do the conformity here, we not just repeat what the feds did, but we do it in such a way that it eases taxpayers filling out their form, but we do it in a way, too, that if there's money to be returned, if there's money available, that it falls to the people who are most in need. I've introduced the Earned Income Tax Credit, this time with the support of Governor Northam. I've introduced it over the years for a couple of times as a way to say that we ought to have Virginia poorest folks, the people who make the least amount of money, be able to keep the money that they work for. And that's what the Earned Income Tax Credit does. It says that, you know, if you are limited in your income, we're not going to take more of your income as a tax. We're actually going to refund that money to you so that you can use it. And one thing we can be sure of with a tax cut like this, contrary to the one where you give back the money to the richest people who then make another investment or keep it in their savings account or whatever, these Virginians will spend that money, which is good for the economy. It'll stimulate the economy, but it'll also take them out of a position of having to make decisions like, do I pay the rent first or do I get my prescription drugs? Critical decisions that Virginians face all the time. So I'm very hopeful that as part of the reconciliation between the federal system of taxation and the Virginia system of taxation, that we include a refundable aspect to the Earned Income Tax Credit to keep money in the hands of the people who need it most.
So what's the opposition to that? What I've heard is that some people suggest that, well, that's all well and good, but we need to protect middle-income taxpayers.
Well, sure we do, and we're talking, it all depends on what you want to define as middle income. There's some neighborhoods of where some people might say these are middle income, but they're struggling to get by. So we need to recognize that when people work, and certainly everybody who objects to this would object to somebody getting something back for not working, and I don't propose to do that at all. What I'm proposing to do is to say that if you are most in need in terms of the vital aspects of life, be able to have a place, a roof over your head, some kind of automobile or transportation network or system to get to work, medical treatment when you need it, and so on, that these are people we ought to be looking at. The opposition comes from, I think, sometimes a cynical notion that we'd be giving something away. It's not giving something away, it's allowing people to keep the money they've earned.
So talk to us a little bit about the announcement concerning Amazon and what impact that's going to have to your constituents in Northern Virginia and the entire state.
Yeah, we are about 25 miles or so away from where the actual location is going to be, but I think it's fair to assume, particularly with the metro system, that some of those people will end up in our community. For Virginians generally, it's good news, and in fact that these are high-paying jobs for the most part, and that will contribute to the growth of our economy. What we got to make sure of is that as we respond with housing and we respond with transportation alternatives, that we take into account, again, the whole of the Virginia population. There are a lot of people who are in businesses that will directly benefit from the fact that the community has grown. There are people with more income in the community and so on. But we got to make sure that we turn around and look too as the people who may be forced out of housing because they can't meet the higher cost of housing, and there will be an impact on the cost of housing, to make sure that workforce housing and affordable housing is included in any of the plans to expand housing as a result of Amazon arriving.
As a matter of fact, I just noticed an announcement this morning out of Seattle that Microsoft was going to invest in affordable housing as a result of the increase in housing prices in Northern California.
Absolutely. That's an example of how responsible corporate people ought to act. And it's a reflection of the fact, too, that as the value of these communities expand, certainly companies benefit, but the whole of the community needs to benefit too. So if it's good for the community, it needs to be good for the community residents, not simply the out-of-state developer who's putting some money into Virginia.
And so what kind of jobs are we talking about that Amazon's going to bring, and what guarantees does the state have that they're going to fulfill that promise?
Well, there's a state subsidy as part of the whole deal, and the deal is more complicated than I can explain, but part of that is that as the company expands, they can draw down on the incentives that they get. But they got to show that the jobs are there and people are getting paid in those jobs. It's not a promise that's made that you just simply get. You have to show that you're demonstrating that you're paying well.
Hey, back to the question of tax conformity, I noticed that the Speaker has now assigned all of those issues to the Rules Committee as opposed to the Committee of First Jurisdiction, ordinarily the Finance Committee.
Right.
What does that tell you, if anything?
Well, I'm on the Rules Committee. I'm a member of the Rules Committee, and I will say, makes me scratch my head. The Rules Committee generally deals with jurisdictional stuff about how the body works, and it deals with things like future studies and that sort of thing. Now we've gotten a number of substantive bills sent to us, like the finance bills, like the bills that relate to ending gun violence. So why would you do that? Not sure, unless it's the Speaker wanting somehow to assert some control over how those bills come out. He did a similar thing in the last session, and ultimately, as the session unfolded, he started sending those bills from the Rules Committee to the Committee of Substance. And I think there's a good prospect that's what he will ultimately do. Now, is he holding them for some purpose, for some votes? I don't know. I don't have any inside information to know how that happens. But I would say I'd be happy for him to send some of the tax bills forward to the Rules Committee so I could have a vote on terms of how that money is distributed and how it's conformed. And he also has, for example, the Equal Rights Amendment and the ending gun violence bills there too. I'd love to be able to vote on those. For example, ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment. Woody, I've been here since 1978. I've been a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment for all those years. I've never had an opportunity to vote on it. Why is that so? Because they get bottled up in committee. The other instance I'll show you where the committee structure, I think, works against the people's choices in terms of dealing with legislation. I've been introducing a bill related to universal background checks. Public opinion polls says that 70 to 80% of Virginians think that's one of the things we ought to do to allow people to have their constitutional rights to a gun. But if you're showing that you're a violent person and you've broken the law in the past, universal background check says, can't have another gun. You've already shown us you're not responsible to have that. That bill gets sent to a subcommittee of the Militia and Police Committee. There are 5 members on that committee. 4 of them we know in advance are NRA supporters, and one's a poor soul who would like to end gun violence, right? So this bill gets defeated 4-1 every year. But there are 140 members in the House of Delegates and the Senate. How is it 4 members can control the outcome of legislation that is supported by so many people? And the answer is that's the way the system's set up right now. But I think, so some of these instances, we can deal with the substance of the issue, but we also have to deal with how issues are dealt with and change the procedure, if you will, and in some instances, the composition of the legislature.
So it may be a good thing then that the Equal Rights Amendment is not going to be heard, at least initially, in the Privileges and Elections Committee. I don't think last year it even got a hearing.
It even got a hearing. I'd like to think so. I don't have any assurance that that might be so. But certainly, again, if you talk to constituents, and constituents in my district, they don't understand what the issue is about. I mean, they make the assumption that there should be equality between the sexes in terms of our constitutional rights. They'd be surprised to learn that Virginia has had many opportunities to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment and turned it down. So it's hard sometimes to explain to constituents why we can't get this work done. And the answer is we got a group of individuals who control the process, who are adamant against change, and adamant against change, equal rights for men and women. Hardly we should find ourselves in a position like this. So I think a number of people in the community, as shown by the last election results in the House of Delegates, have concluded they can't necessarily change the minds of the old crusty old white men who've controlled this place for so many years. Sometimes they have to change the composition of the legislature. That's why there was such a big turnover last election cycle. 15 new members came here. I'm delighted with what happened from the Democratic side, because now the Democratic caucus is a caucus that reflects the composition of Virginia. Half women, unheard of. Major step forward, should have happened a long time ago. Transgender person. All ethnic groups are involved, and so on. Young mothers. The House of Delegates Democratic Caucus is now looking like Virginia. And when we look like Virginia, we'll act like Virginians. And we won't be simply trying to preserve what may have been a good idea, even though it wasn't really a good idea when it was put in place decades ago. But be more reflective of what the modern day world is like and more responsive to community needs.
Some people argue that it's merely symbolic to have a vote on the Equal Rights Amendment because the Congress set the date of ratification to be 1982, I believe, and that even though Virginia may be the 38th state, it will be a nullity.
Well, let's say that if it's symbolic, I'd say it's a good symbol we ought to reflect. We ought to reflect equality in passing it. But the other thing about it is, that's a question that has to be answered in the courts as to whether or not it would be a substantive or not. I don't see that as a reason to turn it down. Symbolism, fine, let's call it symbolism, but let's pass it. Let's also then start the process of resolving the issue as to whether or not our ratification will be the final state or whether the Congress has to act additionally. So I don't see that as a reason to not do it.
I see you're still an ardent supporter of a minimum wage in the state of Virginia. I believe you have some legislation once more pursuing that.
Woody, the minimum wage in Virginia is $7 a quarter.
$7.25 an hour.
And that goes back a couple of decades.
So even with inflation, it should be a lot more.
I start off by saying to people, I'm not talking about increasing the minimum wage. I'm talking about truing it up with inflation. And if you take the minimum wage value, what purchasing power in the late 60s, and true it up to today, it would be about $11.10. So let's do that. Let's first give men and women an opportunity to keep up with inflation and true it up. And then after that, let's make sure the minimum wage moves with the cost of living. So that we're talking then about giving poor people and people of limited income and people with jobs that have minimum pay an opportunity to keep up with just the basics and so on. And then we can debate beyond that whether the minimum wage ought to be higher, and I actually believe it ought to be higher. My position is essentially a compromise position to get us on the way to reflect for people who have low-paying jobs that they can keep up with society.
And of course, there are businesses who consistently and continually argue that increasing the minimum wage is going to drive them out of business, it's going to prevent them from hiring teenagers. I haven't seen that impact in other places that have raised the minimum wage.
Around the country, that's true. In fact, there are some studies that show that it enhances economic activity and actually is a plus to economic growth. One thing you can know about these people who get the minimum wage and who would get the higher minimum wage, they're going to spend it because they need it. They're talking about basic necessities. That's going to contribute to the growth of the economy. And if the case is that you're running a business now and the only way you can stay in business is to underpay your employees, then you need to look at your business plan. Your business plan should never start off by saying, the way I can keep this place alive and the way I can grow it is I'll pay people less money. You should pay people what the prevailing wages are, build your business plan around that, and when everybody does that, your success in business is going to be dependent upon your management, not on underpaying people.
Was it in 2017 that there was a ballot question in terms of right to work, enshrining that in the state constitution?
Yeah, it failed.
And it lost, didn't it?
Yeah, it failed. And now we've got people who are still arguing that, but it's really kind of a false argument. It is unfortunately the case in Virginia that only about 4% of the people are unionized, and that has worked to their disadvantage in being able to get things like the minimum wage increased and so on, and reasonable working conditions.
We're coming up once again on the necessity to do a census count, which will have a significant impact on redrawing both congressional and state legislative districts and beyond, actually. And I notice once more you are pursuing a nonpartisan commission to redraw those kinds of lines. We have a matter pending in court, and a special master will be redrawing lines, but I take it you think it's better for the courts not to be involved and for a nonpartisan commission to take part of that process.
Now, Woody, I want to first note that I don't give up easily. So the fact that I've started this in 1982 doesn't mean I'm going to give up. It's our responsibility to do fair redistricting. We don't have a fair system now, so the court has intervened, and that's good. The court's going to create a fair set of districts. But with the 2020 census, the responsibility again is upon us to create fair and equitable districts. I don't think we as legislators can do that. We've got too much self-interest in this thing. The first thing we're going to do is try to protect our own hides, right? So the way you do that is the way a number of states, now like approaching half the states do it, is that they give it to somebody independent of the legislature. Some people use academicians, some people use staff. There are various ways that you can get the politicians themselves out of drawing the lines to enhance the likelihood they're going to get reelected, as opposed to just facing a community of interest where they have to stand on the merits of what they're doing. So I'm hopeful, and One Virginia 2021 has been a marvelous organization that has enhanced the public's awareness and knowledge of what gerrymandering is all about. Gerrymandering is a way to stack up district lines so that you enhance your ability to win and you enhance the ability of your partisan friends to win. One Virginia 2021 says that we ought to look at how other states take a look at redistricting and set up an independent body to do the redistricting. Until that happens, you're going to see the court continuing to intervene in these elections and continuing to redraw the district in Virginia. They did it 10 years ago. They did it actually back in the 1980s, and they're about to do it again. Come on, Virginians, let's be responsible. Let's do it ourselves in a way that's fair by setting up an independent commission.
Now, your resolution would have to pass the General Assembly this year, then there would have to be an intervening election
Which there will be in 2019.
and put on the ballot in 20. Would it have to pass one more time?
It has to pass twice with an intervening election, and then it goes to referendum. And when I talk to citizens all around who now have a heightened understanding of how this system works and sometimes works against them, I don't think there's any question but what it would pass in a referendum. The people who stand in the way are the people who want to maintain their majorities. And that's what the gerrymandering comes from. It's what it's all about. I don't think there's any question but what it wouldn't be approved by the people.
Talked a little bit about schools. I wanted to draw upon your experience as an educator, especially in terms of, you talked about guns, and we all know that there's been a plethora of violence with guns nationwide for the past, 15 to 20 years now, and nothing's been done. There are various proposals. There was a special committee, I think, that was set up by the Assembly to study this issue. They've come out with some recommendations. How do you think we need to treat the question of gun violence in our schools?
Yeah, oh my gosh. Woody, if you take a look at the hundreds of years of our history until you get to about 20 years ago, we didn't have gun violence to speak of. Now the graph has gone sky high with the amount of violence. It's to the point now where you can have mass shooting. It doesn't even make the front pages. If it's in the news, it's in the news one day. It seems like we've gained an acceptance of the misuse of guns and the use of gun violence. And when we're going to say enough is enough and say to the gun lobbyists, sorry guys, there's this Second Amendment thing, but it doesn't give you the right to shoot other people, doesn't give you the right to take people's lives. We can have a system where you can own guns, but you don't misuse guns. And there are numerous proposals for that. The one committee that was set up by the Speaker to look at gun violence and to look at violence in school or safety in schools, particularly left out guns as an issue. Well, that's not realistic. Arming people in schools can lead to serious problems. The first time there's violence in the school and the police arrive, we don't know that person with the gun is legitimate or if that's the shooter. All kind of things can occur. What we need to do is not bless the use of guns. We need to look at school safety in a way that we have taken guns away from violent people when they apply to get a gun, and we've increased our penalties for the misuse of guns. So the stories now that I hear and the studies that are made about the increased trauma on the part of young people as a result of these, I guess you can say that it makes sense to have drills where kids get under their desk and stuff. They don't know when that drill is a drill and when it's real. And when you have that continued trauma, you get kids who are afraid to go to school. We got to get a handle on this thing as a society and reduce the incidence of gun violence by taking positive action on these gun safety measures. They're common sense things that the public support, but they're gun lobbyists who bring in immense amounts of money into campaigns and affect the way people vote. And I'm sorry, no gun lobbyist or other lobbyists can pay me enough money to decide how I vote. And it's immoral, candidly, what we're allowing to happen with the misuse of guns.
And of course, we've come to, when I say we, the school systems have come to rely on law enforcement in terms of school resource officers now. And they tend to have a prosecutorial mentality, generally speaking, and we've had a lot of young kids referred to juvenile court as a result of that. How do we deal with that issue?
It's gotten out of hand. There's a serious issue now about the school classroom to the jailhouse stream that has evolved out of using school resource officers that are police officers. School resource officers ought to be people who are trained in psychology and in child development and so on, who can intervene in a positive way to turn an incident that's an incident involving a child into a positive learning experience, not into a criminal experience where you go to jail. So I'm pleased to say that the legislature is working on this and we're making progress on it. The governor has proposed in his budget an increased amount of money for the funding of school not resource officers, but school counselors. They're the people who need to work with these children, not the courts.
And I understand that ratio is way out of whack.
Oh, we
Virginia is
don't
way out
come
of
close
whack.
on the national ratio level. We need to, we all learn from experiences as we grow up. So when we make a childhood mistake, you don't deal with that mistake by simply locking somebody up. You make that a learning experience where, in a counseling fashion over a period of time, the child learns how to be a productive, positive citizen. And this is not Pollyanna stuff. This is, I think, the real way that we need to work in our society to not turn childhood behavior into criminal behavior. We need to turn childhood behavior into learning experiences that make for productive, positive citizens.
The governor's budget also proposes to increase pay for state employees and also for teachers.
Yeah.
How important is that? I mean, I understand we have a problem keeping teachers because neighboring jurisdictions pay more.
Well, I think the number now is that we have like 1,000 openings. That's 1,000 classrooms where there's not a teacher present. There's some kind of substitute or some kind of way to make do until they find somebody to work there. And why don't people want to go into teaching? It's $9,000 less than the national average. So
$9,000 less
than the national average. So when you get situations like that, you don't have people applying for the job. Now, thank God there are good people who are willing to do some of this work regardless of what the pay is. But for most people, they too have to balance the family budget. They have a family, they have children and so on. And so we need to reward teachers. And I taught for a couple of years in my experience. And I will tell you, it's the hardest work I've ever done in my life, bar none. We need to reward people who are willing to take on this as an occupation by at least paying the prevailing averages of what others are making. We need to pay them accordingly and reward them for taking on this responsibility to work with our young people. It's not sending a good message to the teacher or to the young children to have such an underpaid scale. And bless the governor for being willing to take that on and make proposals in his budget that would rectify that.
Yeah, because that pay pyramid is definitely inverted. I mean, here's the point in a kid's life where they need the most from the best, so to speak.
Yeah.
And those teachers are paid a lot less than our institutions of higher learning pay professors.
I explained to my son, who became a teacher, and he would talk to me about some students in his classes. And those were students who had problems and gave him problems and so on. And I explained to him, they're the ones who need you. All those who are busy studying, doing their work and so on, they're going to be fine. It's these that act out and so on. You have a responsibility to take on that need and respond to it. It's what schools are about.
Thank you, Delegate Ken Plum.
My pleasure always, Woody. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.